There's a strange moment in life when people realize you weren't lucky, silent, or confused. You were aware. That moment is uncomfortable. Not for you, but for them. Because while they were busy assuming you didn't notice, didn't understand, or didn't connect the dots, you were already 10 steps ahead, quietly watching the whole pattern play out. You weren't guessing. You weren't hoping. You weren't improvising. You were observing, calculating, and letting people reveal themselves without interruption. Here's a fact most people don't like to admit. Humans reveal their true intentions through repetition, not confession. And repetition is slow. It requires patience to catch. You had that patience. That's why this realization feels sudden to them, but familiar to you. What's funny in a very dry, almost disrespectful way is how shocked people become when they find out you understood the situation the entire time. The same people who thought you were too quiet, too calm, or not getting it, suddenly feel foolish when they realize you were never behind. You were just letting the truth mature. Like bad behavior left unattended, it always exposes itself eventually. This isn't about ego, it's about timing. You didn't rush to react because reactions feed illusions. You didn't confront early because early confrontation gives liars time to rehearse. You waited long enough for actions to speak without your help. And now the story has no loopholes. What makes this moment powerful isn't that they finally see you. It's that they now see themselves through the clarity you already had. And that's where the discomfort comes from. Not because you changed, but because you didn't. So if they look uneasy now, if their tone has shifted, if their confidence suddenly feels forced, don't take it personally. That's just the sound of delayed awareness catching up. And trust me, nothing humbles people faster than realizing you already knew what they were still pretending wasn't obvious. Number one, you clocked the pattern before it had a name. Before anyone else could even sense it, you noticed the rhythm of behavior, the subtle shifts in mood, the repeated mistakes and the hidden motives. While people were reacting to events as if they were isolated incidents, you were connecting the dots, seeing the chain of cause and effect, and recognizing that this was not random chaos. It was a pattern. You didn't need someone to label it or a book to explain it. Your observation alone was enough to understand the truth. That alone set you apart, because the world often values loud reactions over quiet understanding, and people mistake surprise for intelligence. You recognized early on that certain individuals and situations repeat themselves in ways most people ignore. The subtle lies that get brushed off, the manipulations that are justified with excuses, the drama that keeps coming back. These weren't anomalies to you. You understood them as signals, and those signals told a story that others were too distracted, too trusting, or too emotional to see. You didn't need proof at every step because the pattern itself was proof, and your patience let it reveal itself fully. By noticing the pattern before it had a name, you gave yourself an edge that no one else even knew existed. You weren't just reacting, you were predicting, positioning, and understanding the rules of a game they hadn't realized was being played. And when they finally caught up, when they finally acted as if they understood what had been happening, the realization hit them. You weren't confused or passive. You had known, you had seen, and you had processed everything long before they could even form the question. This awareness, quiet and almost invisible, created a power they couldn't touch. It wasn't about being better or smarter. It was about clarity, patience, and discernment. That moment when they finally notice, when they finally feel the weight of what you already understood, is not just surprising. It's humiliating for them and validating for you. You were always ahead, simply because you saw what was there, before anyone else even knew to look. Number two, you understood power before you ever tried to use it. Power isn't something flashy or loud. It's subtle, quiet, and often invisible until it's too late. You saw that early. While most people scramble to assert control, fight for attention, or push their way to the front, you were watching. You noticed who really made decisions, who influenced outcomes without speaking, and who got things done without needing applause. You weren't in a rush to claim authority because you understood that true power doesn't announce itself. It accumulates silently, unnoticed, until it becomes undeniable. You observed how people behaved when no one was watching, how fear and respect were often confused, and how influence could be wielded without anyone realizing it. You noticed the weight of presence, the value of patience, and the quiet advantage of understanding dynamics before stepping in. You didn't need to dominate a room, prove yourself to strangers, or force your way into leadership. You simply positioned yourself where influence naturally gathered. That's why, when moments of decision came, you weren't caught off guard. You didn't have to scramble or overcompensate because you had already read the room, understood the players, and aligned yourself with outcomes rather than illusions. What makes this different from ordinary awareness is that you knew timing and strategy mattered more than volume. You recognized that trying too hard, showing ambition too early, or demanding recognition often backfires. The strongest influence comes from restraint, from observing and moving only when the moment is ripe. That patience allowed you to understand the unspoken rules of power, the hidden currents most people miss until they're swept away. When others finally realize what's happening, they think you just got lucky, or that you somehow jumped ahead without effort. They don't see the countless hours of quiet observation, the careful judgment, and the understanding that power is about perception, patience, and insight more than action. You weren't just surviving the system, you were mastering it without making a show of it. And now, when the consequences of your awareness unfold, they finally see it. You were never behind. You were always in control. Number 3, you never confused potential with reality. Most people spend their lives chasing what could be instead of paying attention to what is. They hold on to hope for others, defend them for what they might become, and make excuses for behavior that repeats over and over. You didn't fall into that trap. You understood that what someone says, promises, or dreams about rarely matters as much as what they consistently do. You learned early that reality isn't shaped by intentions, feelings, or potential. It's shaped by actions. You noticed how often people mistake optimism for loyalty, kindness, or talent. They forgive repeated mistakes because they're sold on the idea of what someone could be. You, however, kept your focus on the evidence in front of you. Every pattern of choice, every decision, every repeated action became your guide. You didn't get seduced by charm, excuses, or grand visions for the future. You saw the truth. People reveal themselves over time, and actions never lie. Because of that clarity, you weren't shocked when reality finally caught up with others. You didn't need dramatic confrontations or sudden realizations to confirm what you already knew. When they failed, floundered, or disappointed, you weren't surprised. You had observed the signs from the beginning. That allowed you to act decisively, to make choices without hesitation, and to protect yourself from wasted energy, time, and emotion. You didn't cling to illusion or waste your resources defending someone's possibilities. You dealt in certainties. The power of understanding reality over potential is that it keeps you unshakable. You don't get frustrated by inconsistency, manipulated by promises, or dragged into unnecessary drama. You operate from clarity, and that clarity gives you a quiet authority that others can't touch. And when people finally realize that you were never blind to the truth, that you always saw what they refused to, it shocks them. They feel caught off guard because they assumed everyone was as easily deceived as they were. You weren't fooled, and now they're realizing it too. That's the moment your insight becomes undeniable. Number 4, you realize loyalty is often just fear in disguise. Most people wear loyalty like a badge, proud to show their commitment to friends, leaders, or causes. They assume loyalty is rare, sacred, or automatically meaningful. You saw something different. You understood early that loyalty is often less about devotion and more about self-preservation. People stay close not because they respect or trust, but because leaving feels risky, uncomfortable, or inconvenient. They follow instructions, echo opinions, and endure nonsense, not out of principle, but because the cost of stepping away is too high. You noticed how people bend under pressure, how they avoid confrontation, and how they silence themselves in ways that appear loyal, but are actually calculated. You could see the difference between genuine allegiance and survival-driven compliance. That understanding gave you an advantage most people miss. You didn't invest in illusions. You didn't assume that a loyal person would act in your best interest simply because they claimed they would. You watched their actions, tested the boundaries, and let behavior reveal true intent over time. Because of that clarity, you weren't blindsided by betrayal, disappointment, or the sudden withdrawal of support. You knew the difference between someone staying because they wanted to and someone staying because they had to. You acted accordingly, protecting your energy, your trust, and your decisions. You didn't overvalue appearances or verbal commitments. You valued consistent, voluntary action, and that perspective kept you grounded when others were caught off guard by the cracks in seemingly steadfast relationships. The moment they realize you understood this all along is quietly devastating for them. They believed loyalty was something you too would blindly respect. They thought you could be swayed by appearances, by declarations, or by pressure. Instead, you were observing, calculating, and discerning all along. And when the facade finally falters and the fear-driven loyalty becomes obvious, you're already steps ahead. You never needed to be shocked or hurt because you had already read the situation accurately. That's the quiet power of understanding loyalty for what it truly is. And it's the moment they realize you weren't fooled, not for a second. Number 5, you knew most advice is given to protect the system, not the truth. From an early stage, you noticed a pattern in the advice people hand out. Most of it doesn't come from a place of insight, experience, or genuine care. It comes from a desire to maintain the status quo. People tell you to be patient, follow the rules, or wait your turn, not because it's necessarily right for you, but because it's safest for them. Systems, institutions, and social hierarchies thrive on compliance, on keeping people predictable, and on ensuring that challenging the norm is expensive, confusing, or uncomfortable. You saw through that long before anyone else did. You realized that advice is rarely neutral. It's a tool, often disguised as guidance, to shape behavior in ways that benefit others more than you. When people urge caution or moderation, it isn't always to protect you. It's to protect themselves or the structure they rely on. That understanding changed how you listened. You didn't dismiss guidance outright, but you filtered it through a lens of awareness. You asked yourself, consciously or unconsciously, who gains if I follow this advice? Who loses? And does it align with the truth I already see? That mindset separated you from everyone else, because while others blindly followed or questioned themselves endlessly, you acted with clarity. Knowing this allowed you to trust your own judgment over conventional wisdom. You stopped overthinking, stopped bending to social pressures, and stopped letting well-meaning but ultimately self-serving advice dictate your choices. You moved with strategy, not obligation, with awareness, not fear. That's why when the system or the people who benefit from it tried to shake you, they were surprised. They assumed you would be manipulated, delayed, or confused the same way everyone else was. And the real brilliance of this understanding is quiet, but undeniable. While others are still trapped in cycles of advice, opinion, and caution, you've already acted. You've already discerned what's true for your path, what matters, and what is irrelevant noise. That's why when the revelation hits them that you've known all along, they feel foolish. The system's rules didn't control you. You were always playing your own game. Number 6, you noticed who benefited from your confusion. From the beginning, you understood that uncertainty is a currency. When people keep you guessing, doubting, or questioning yourself, they gain power without ever lifting a finger. While most individuals accept confusion as a personal flaw or a natural part of life, you saw it for what it really was, a tool others used to manipulate, control, or maintain an advantage. You realized early that your hesitation, your second guessing, and your attempts to figure it out were often exactly what others counted on to stay ahead. You observed how quickly people exploit small cracks in perception. A missed detail, a delayed response, or a moment of indecision can give someone else influence over outcomes, decisions, or narratives. While everyone else seemed blind to the invisible strings being pulled, you could trace them back to the source. You knew who benefited from your confusion and, more importantly, why. That knowledge alone gave you a quiet edge, because while others were satisfied reacting emotionally, you were positioning yourself with foresight. Understanding this also changed the way you moved. You stopped over-explaining, stopped overreacting, and stopped assuming that every shift in behavior was random. You filtered interactions through the question, who actually profits if I don't see clearly? That allowed you to respond selectively, strategically, and decisively. You were no longer playing in someone else's game. You were in control of your perception, and therefore your power. When they finally realized that you were never confused, that every misstep they thought they exploited was already anticipated, the effect is disorienting. The same people who assumed your hesitation gave them leverage suddenly see you as untouchable. You weren't lucky, passive, or oblivious. You were observing, calculating, and guarding your clarity. That realization isn't just humbling for them. It's the moment they understand they underestimated you completely. Your clarity wasn't just awareness, it was armor. And now that armor has made the game unplayable for anyone trying to manipulate you. Number 7, you stopped explaining yourself because explanations were being weaponized. You realized early on that every word you said, every reason you gave, and every justification you offered could be twisted into a tool against you. People have a way of taking honesty and turning it into a weapon, twisting intentions, creating guilt, or framing your clarity as arrogance. While most people keep talking, hoping that their truth will convince others, you recognize that speaking too much often gives others power over your narrative. The moment you understood that, you changed everything. You began observing not just what people said, but how they processed information. You saw how explanations can be dissected, misinterpreted, or used to manipulate. You noticed that the more someone tries to prove themselves, the more they hand over control. That's why you made a conscious shift. Instead of defending every choice, clarifying every thought, or justifying every action, you focused on acting, observing, and letting results speak for themselves. Actions don't lie. They don't get twisted. They can't be weaponized. Stopping explanations wasn't about silence for effect. It was about precision and protection. You weren't being mysterious. You were safeguarding your clarity and your energy. You realized that energy spent defending yourself is energy taken from progress, understanding, and strategy. By removing the opportunity for manipulation, you gained something far more powerful: control over your own story. When others finally notice, the shock is palpable. They assumed they could influence your perception of yourself, bend your narrative, or provoke reactions that keep them in power. Instead, they encounter someone who doesn't need to justify, doesn't need to explain, and doesn't hand over ammunition for control. That quiet, deliberate restraint flips the entire dynamic. You're no longer a participant in their game. You're observing from a place of authority they can't reach. And that's when the realization hits them. They've been trying to manipulate someone who never gave them the chance. You were already steps ahead, and every word they expected to provoke only confirmed their own miscalculation. Number 8. You understood that being liked and being respected rarely coexist. You noticed early that the world often confuses popularity with authority and friendliness with influence. Most people chase approval, bending themselves to fit expectations, smoothing over conflicts and saying what others want to hear, believing that being liked will protect them, open doors, or bring opportunities. You saw through that. You understood that the very traits that make someone universally liked, agreeableness, compliance, charm, often come at the expense of real respect. Respect isn't given because you're pleasant or convenient. It's earned through consistency, integrity, and the courage to stand firm even when it makes people uncomfortable. You recognize that trying to achieve both at the same time is a trap. People who aim to be liked often dilute their power, compromise their values, and invite manipulation. You chose the harder route. You accepted that some would dislike you, misinterpret you, or even push back hard. That was a small price to pay for the unshakable respect that comes from being unwavering, from being clear about who you are, what you value, and what you will or won't tolerate. You didn't aim to win popularity contests. You aimed to be undeniable, to occupy space with authority that doesn't need approval to exist. This understanding gave you freedom. You stopped trying to please, stopped softening your edges for comfort, and stopped fearing judgment. You moved through situations guided by principle and insight, not by applause. That clarity created a quiet power. People may grumble, criticize, or resent, but they cannot ignore you. They see that you operate on a level above performative gestures or empty flattery, and that creates a tension most aren't prepared for. When they finally realize it, the surprise is unmistakable. They expected someone pliable, someone who could be swayed with charm, consensus, or social approval. Instead, they encounter someone who commands respect without needing to seek approval. And in that moment, they understand the truth you already knew. Being respected isn't about being liked. It's about being seen, fully, honestly, and without compromise. You mastered that balance, and now they're left reckoning with the fact that they never had the leverage they thought they did. Number 9. You clocked how emotions are used as leverage. You saw it long before anyone admitted it. Emotions are not just feelings, they're tools. Most people believe tears, anger, guilt, or over-the-top excitement are pure expressions of intent, honesty, or connection. You understood that they can be manipulated, wielded, and weaponized. A smile could be a distraction, a tear could be a tactic, and outrage could be a carefully timed pressure point. You didn't need to be told. You watched it unfold repeatedly, noticing patterns others either ignored or rationalized away. That awareness gave you a clarity that felt uncomfortable for people around you, because they assumed emotion alone was enough to sway you, and it never was. You realized early that being sensitive to people's feelings without being controlled by them is a skill most never learn. While others reacted, got defensive, or overcommitted because someone looked hurt or seemed offended, you observed. You let people reveal their true motives through emotional cues without being hijacked by them. You understood that manipulating emotion is often easier than manipulating logic, and those who mastered it expected you to play the same predictable game. But you didn't. You separated action from affect, choice from reaction, and truth from performance. This understanding allowed you to navigate relationships and situations with unprecedented clarity. You didn't get swept away by dramatic gestures or guilt trips. You responded with precision, timing, and control, because you weren't just reacting, you were analyzing. You knew which emotions were genuine, which were strategic, and which were entirely fabricated. That gave you a subtle dominance others couldn't contest, because your calm, measured presence undermined their attempts to control outcomes through theatrics. When people finally realize you weren't manipulated, shocked and frustrated hits them at once. They thought their emotion would bend you, guide you, or control your choices. Instead, you remained unshaken, unflustered, and decisive. You weren't cold or detached. You were aware, and that awareness made all the difference. And in that realization, they see a truth they never expected. You were never their audience. You were their observer, quietly seeing the play, predicting the moves, and understanding the game long before they even began. Number 10, you knew timing mattered more than speed. While most people rush through life, reacting to every moment as if speed equals success, you understood something deeper. Timing is everything. Acting too early can expose weaknesses, provoke unnecessary conflict, or give people time to prepare against you. Acting too late can make you irrelevant or reactive, but acting at the right moment, decisively, strategically, with full awareness, changes everything. You learn to wait, to observe, and to let circumstances unfold, because the value of timing isn't just in action, it's in leverage, clarity, and impact. You noticed how often people confuse activity with progress. They move quickly, make noise, and assume that appearing busy is the same as being effective. You knew the difference. You understood that some battles are won before they're fought, simply by waiting, studying, and choosing the moment when your action hits with maximum effect. That patience isn't laziness, it's intelligence. It's the quiet power of understanding that the world doesn't reward speed. It rewards precision, foresight, and presence. This awareness gave you control over situations that seemed chaotic to others. While they scrambled, panicked, or overextended themselves, you were calm, observing, and calculating. You weren't behind. They were moving too fast, acting on impulse and giving away advantage. By mastering timing, you became untouchable. You could strike with clarity, step back without regret, and let the natural unfolding of events reveal the truth of your insight. When people finally notice, they assume your advantage was luck, intuition, or some hidden skill they lack. They don't see the discipline it took to wait, to watch, and to act only when the moment aligned perfectly with your understanding. They realize too late that you weren't chasing opportunities. You were letting opportunities chase you. That's the quiet brilliance of mastering timing. The world moves frantically, but you move deliberately, and when the right moment arrives, you're already exactly where you need to be. They see it, they respect it, and they can't undo it. You weren't late, you were always on time. Number 11. You saw that chaos often protects incompetence. You noticed early on that chaos isn't random. It's carefully cultivated, consciously or unconsciously, to shield weakness, hide mistakes, and maintain control. When things are messy, when rules are unclear, and when confusion reigns, people who lack competence can continue unchecked. They rely on distraction, deflection, and noise to prevent scrutiny. While most people are stressed, overwhelmed, or emotionally hijacked by disorder, you saw the pattern. You recognize that chaos is a curtain behind which mediocrity hides, and those who thrive in it are not exceptional. They're opportunists, exploiting gaps that most people never notice. You understood that when everyone is scrambling to manage symptoms, no one has time to address the root. Leaders who are unprepared, co-workers who are lazy, and systems that are flawed rely on confusion to survive. You didn't let the noise pull you in. You observed, you tracked, and you identified where the gaps were. You could see clearly because you weren't panicking. You weren't trying to cover for incompetence, and you weren't competing in the chaos for attention or validation. You recognized that calm clarity is a rare weapon in a storm, and you wielded it quietly, deliberately, and effectively. This understanding changed everything. You no longer wasted energy trying to fix what was designed to break, or arguing with people who thrived on confusion. You made decisions from a place of insight, targeting what truly mattered, bypassing distractions, and letting natural consequences expose the truth. You weren't just surviving in the chaos. You were analyzing it, mapping it, and positioning yourself above it. When people finally realize that you've been immune to their disorder, the impact is undeniable. They assume the storm would weaken you, make you frantic, or force mistakes. Instead, you navigated it with composure, foresight, and precision. That's the moment they understand you weren't overwhelmed by chaos, because you never let it define your reality. You saw the patterns, anticipated the outcomes, and moved decisively, while others remained trapped in confusion. You were never a participant in the chaos. They were. And that's the power of clarity when everyone else is blind to the truth. Number 12. You accepted that being chosen doesn't mean being celebrated. You understood early on that recognition is rare, fleeting, and often irrelevant to those who are doing the real work. Being chosen, whether for insight, responsibility, or opportunity, doesn't come with applause, fanfare, or approval. Most people assume that visibility equals validation, that being acknowledged is proof of worth. You saw through that illusion. You realized that real selection is quiet, unnoticed, and sometimes even resented by those who can't comprehend why you were chosen. You noticed how easily people mistake acknowledgement for achievement. They crave applause, expect praise, and let the absence of recognition dictate their sense of value. You rejected that measure. You understood that being chosen is about responsibility, discernment, and insight, not about popularity or approval. The truth is, when you are selected for understanding, timing, or foresight, you often operate in a space where the majority can't follow. That's why being chosen often feels isolating. You are ahead, seeing what others don't, carrying burdens others can't carry, and making decisions they aren't prepared to understand. This acceptance gave you freedom. You no longer sought validation, defended your choices to skeptics, or explained your position to critics. You focused on doing what needed to be done, not on ensuring that it was celebrated. That mindset allowed you to work with clarity, courage, and confidence, even when the world seemed indifferent or dismissive. You understood that true selection is its own reward, and external recognition is merely a byproduct, not the measure of success. When others finally notice, the moment is disorienting for them. They assumed being chosen would mean being visible, admired, or affirmed. But your composure defies that expectation. They see the truth. You were never performing for recognition, never seeking approval, and never reliant on applause. You were chosen, and that choice carried its own authority. They are left grappling with the fact that the acknowledgement they assumed was necessary was never part of the equation. You were never in need of celebration, because being chosen was validation enough. Number 13. You stopped trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. You noticed early on that some people aren't interested in truth. They're invested in control. They have a narrative they want to preserve, a version of reality that benefits them, and no amount of explanation, reasoning, or proof will change that. Most people waste years trying to convince others of their perspective, bending themselves into endless arguments, debates, and justifications. You didn't fall for it. You understood that some minds are closed not by ignorance but by choice, and the harder you push, the more they resist. Recognizing this, you shifted your energy. You stopped over-explaining, stopped pleading for recognition, and stopped attempting to make people see what they weren't ready or willing to see. You realized that forcing understanding doesn't create clarity. It creates conflict, frustration, and wasted effort. Instead, you focused on what you could control: your actions, your decisions, and your alignment with reality. You accepted that misunderstanding is not a reflection of your failure, but a reflection of their unwillingness to confront the truth. This decision transformed your interactions. You became selective about who deserved your explanations and who didn't. You preserved your clarity by choosing silence over argument, observation over persuasion, and action over justification. That wasn't coldness or arrogance. It was strategy. It was the recognition that some people's inability to understand you is their limitation, not yours. By stepping out of the cycle of attempted explanation, you reclaimed power and focus, leaving them to wrestle with their confusion while you moved ahead. When they finally realize it, the shock is palpable. They assumed their misunderstanding could control you, provoke you, or shape your path. Instead, you had been operating independently, aligned with your own insight, unshaken by their resistance. They are left unsettled, recognizing too late that they underestimated you. You weren't lost in their narratives, trapped by their biases, or begging for validation. You were already free, already clear, and already moving beyond the very people who thought they could define you. That's the quiet brilliance of choosing clarity over approval, the point where understanding yourself becomes your ultimate power. Number 14. You already grieved the truth before they discovered it. Long before anyone else realized the depth of reality, you had faced it head-on, alone and unflinching. You didn't wait for confirmation from others to feel the weight of betrayal, disappointment, or harsh truths. You processed it internally, acknowledged the stakes, and allowed yourself to fully understand what had been happening around you. That early confrontation with reality gave you a resilience most people never develop because they only react once the shock hits. You were ahead of the curve, grieving not because you were weak, but because you were wise enough to see what others refused to admit. You understood that life doesn't pause for clarity, and that the sooner you accept uncomfortable truths, the sooner you regain control. While others were busy rationalizing, deflecting, or pretending not to notice, you had already worked through the emotions, the lessons, and the decisions that clarity demanded. You knew that grief isn't about wallowing. It's about understanding the loss, learning from it, and moving forward with awareness. That process gave you a kind of quiet strength that made later realizations from others almost irrelevant. You weren't blindsided because you had already accounted for what the world would reveal, and you had already prepared yourself to act with wisdom, not reaction. By grieving in advance, you disarmed their attempts to shock or manipulate you. When they finally came to the realization that you had always known, their surprise was ineffective because your emotional processing had already been done. You were calm, decisive, and unaffected by the delayed awakening of others. They had underestimated your foresight, your patience, and your emotional intelligence. The power of this insight lies in its subtlety. It's invisible to those who think revelation comes as sudden enlightenment. You had already lived the truth, processed it, and emerged stronger, while they were only beginning to grapple with it. That gap between your awareness and their discovery is where your advantage lives. You weren't just prepared, you were untouchable, because by the time they realized, you had long moved past the point where their shock could matter. You were always ahead, always resilient, and always unshakable. Conclusion. Everything we've explored here isn't about luck, chance, or being in the right place at the right time. It's about awareness, discipline, and the quiet mastery of observation. It's about understanding the rules of the world before anyone else realizes they exist, noticing patterns that others dismiss, and acting with precision while chaos surrounds you. You saw the truth before it needed explaining, recognized influence before it demanded attention, and processed reality before others were ready to face it. That's why when people finally catch up, when the facade falls and clarity hits them, they feel shocked, confused, and even a little foolish. But you've long since moved past surprise. You weren't blindsided, you weren't manipulated, and you weren't reacting. You were already steps ahead. This isn't about ego or showing superiority. It's about the power of understanding life as it is, not as others want you to see it. It's about recognizing the difference between potential and reality, loyalty and fear, influence and appearance, chaos and strategy. It's about standing firm in your clarity, protecting your energy, and letting actions rather than explanations or emotions define your reality. The world may not celebrate you immediately, and many will misunderstand you along the way. But that's the cost of operating from insight rather than expectation. And the reward, quiet authority, unwavering confidence, and the satisfaction of knowing you were never fooled. You've been chosen by life's truths, not by applause. You've observed while others were distracted, waited while others rushed, and understood while others pretended not to see. That perspective gives you an edge that's invisible, yet undeniable. You move with purpose, precision, and calm, knowing the world will eventually recognize what you've always known. If this message resonated with you, make sure to join the movement. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. The truth isn't meant to stay hidden. It's meant to be seen, understood, and shared. Stay blessed always.